I watched a wealthy man drop to his knees before a poor little girl, simply because she looked exactly like the woman he once loved and abandoned. What he didn't know, that girl was his daughter. And the woman, her mother, stood behind him, carrying the scars of a past where she was paid to disappear, called a stain on the family name. The village turned its back. The children were bullied. And when the truth came out, not everyone was ready to forgive. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next emotional and unforgettable chapters from us. It all began on a scorching afternoon when fate arrived with the crash of a luxury car. Under the unforgiving glare of the late morning sun, a narrow dirt road curled along the hills of northern Ghana like a faded ribbon of rust. The dust was red thick and fine, the kind that stuck to your skin, your shoes, even your breath. And on that winding road just past the baobab tree that split its shadow into the scrubby bushes below, three small figures pushed a wooden cart groaning with fruit. Kai was up front, his skinny hands gripping the makeshift handles, shoulders hunched forward with quiet determination. At 13, he had the stature of a boy still caught between childhood and something heavier. Not yet a man, but with the worry lines of one. Behind him, Mason, the middle child, moved with a bounce in his step, humming a tune only he seemed to hear. His task was to keep the cart balanced, keep the fruit from falling as the wheels bounced over the potholes. Lana, the youngest, barely 8, ran beside the cart, with a straw fan in hand, waving it gently over the crates of mangoes and pineapples like a priestess guarding something sacred. Her braids bounced her eyes bright with effort and joy. The sun was brutal, hammering down from a sky that hadn't seen clouds in days. Heat rose from the ground in trembling waves and the fruit inside the crates. Papayas, oranges, even a single shy jackfruit seemed to sweat under their own skins. The climb up the hill was steep and the cart creaked under the weight. But no one complained. They had made this journey every market day for the past 2 years. At the top of the hill, just before the highway, there was a flat clearing shaded by a crooked neem tree. That was their spot. They had no permit, no stall, no plastic umbrella like the lucky sellers at the market down in town. But they had the slope. And from there they could see the line of cars coming down the tarmac, a promise that someone might stop, might roll down their window, might ask, how much for the mangoes? They arrived breathless. Kai gently eased the cart into place, his shirt soaked in sweat. Mason pulled out 3 bricks to place beneath the wheels, preventing the cart from rolling back down the slope. Lana sat on a worn stool they kept hidden under a bush, fanning herself and the fruit alternately. Across the road, under a larger tree where goats sometimes grazed, a woman stood watching. Her hands were stained with soil, her dress frayed, but clean. She didn't speak. She rarely did in public. But her eyes followed every movement of her children. That was Hannah. She stood in the same place every morning after the children left with the cart. From there she could see them, but they couldn't see her. She didn't want them to worry, didn't want them to think she doubted their strength. But she watched. Always watched. There was a stillness to her. A calm that came from a decade of struggle so quiet, so constant that it had become her skin. Her face was soft, beautiful, in a way that surprised people. Her lips were full but rarely smiled. Her eyes, large and lined at the corners, had the weight of a past she refused to name. When she looked at Lana, especially when the child wasn't looking, there was a kind of ache in her gaze, a mixture of guilt and longing and something harder like defiance. Hannah had arrived in this village 7 years ago, with nothing but a tattered bag, a swollen belly, and a story she never told. She bought a tiny plot of land with what little she had left, a piece of rocky, sun-baked soil that had once belonged to an old widow who died with no heirs. Every neighbor had warned her the soil was cursed too dry to grow anything but despair. But Hannah planted anyway. She tilled, she carried water in yellow jerry cans from the stream nearly half a mile away, and she planted. and somehow things grew. The fruit she harvested each week wasn't much, but it was hers. She taught her children to value what came from the ground, to wake with the sun, to push the cart together, to never beg. We sell or we carry it back. But we do not beg, she had told them one night, when they came home with only 2 coins and aching legs. Kai had never forgotten that. Now, as he wiped his brow with the hem of his shirt and scanned the highway, he repeated those words to himself like a prayer. Mason whistled. Lana counted the oranges, then recounted them, then started singing under her breath. The cars whizzed by. No one stopped. Minutes passed. Then a quarter hour. Then more. Kai picked up the cardboard sign they used, held it up proudly, at shoulder height. Fresh fruit, no chemicals, homegrown. Still nothing. From across the road, Hannah saw Lana raise her arms in mock despair, dramatic as ever. Mason made a joke, something about the fruit going to college before anyone bought it, and Lana burst into laughter. Even Kai cracked a smile. Hannah's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but almost. Then her expression shifted. A car had slowed. Not stopped, not yet, but slowed. It was black, sleek, and unfamiliar on this road. Hannah took a step forward without meaning to. Her fingers curled against her palm. The car paused. The engine hummed indecisive. Kai stood tall. Mason fixed his shirt collar. Lana stood on the stool and waved. The car didn't stop. It accelerated. The dust it kicked up swept across the stand like a red fog. The children coughed. Mason waved a hand in the air, muttering. Lana sneezed. Kai simply stared after the car, a muscle twitching in his jaw. And across the road, Hannah's shoulders dropped. She turned and began walking back to her field, back to the ridges where cassava leaves shimmered in the heat and hope hung low like the ripe mangoes on the trees. But before she disappeared into the bush, she turned once more. She looked at her children, at Kai holding the sign with stubborn pride, at Mason laughing with Lana as if the world hadn't just ignored them again, at Lana dancing now in the shade, her laughter the only music in that heat-strangled silence, and her gaze softened. But not with love, with something older, deeper, regret, longing, memory. For a moment she didn't see Lana at all. She saw someone else. A face etched in the past burned into her bones, buried beneath years of labor and silence. She blinked, shook it off, and walked on. Behind her, the red slope shimmered under the weight of the sun, and something heavier, something waiting, just beyond the hill. Under the tilted shade of the neem tree, the small stand stood like a stubborn little prayer on the edge of the world. The cart had been unpacked, its wooden panels propped open to reveal the vibrant treasure it carried: golden mangoes, dusty green guavas, shy pineapples, and a basket of overripe bananas that no one ever asked for. Lana had even arranged a cloth over the corner, placing the ripest fruit in the front like bait for passing eyes. But the road remained quiet. Kai sat on an overturned bucket, his knees up, his elbows perched on them. His eyes didn't rest. They flicked constantly to the horizon, where the asphalt shimmered like black water. Nothing. Just the heat wobbling. Thirsty, Mason said, pulling out a reused plastic bottle from under his sheet. The water inside was lukewarm. He unscrewed the cap slowly, glancing at his brother. Share it. Kai reminded him, not looking away from the road. I know, Mason replied, taking a careful sip and passing it to Lana. Kai took the bottle last, but didn't drink. He just held it between his palms, feeling the warmth seep through like it might soak into his blood. Behind them, the hill they had climbed seemed taller than usual. The red slope stretched downward, mocking them, and further below, far from view, was their home, a patched-up mud hut with corrugated iron that clanged like a drum when it rained. The sun was overhead now. Midday was creeping in, and still not a single customer. A man on a motorbike zipped past, scarf covering his face, dust trailing behind like smoke. Lana covered the fruit instinctively with the cloth, shielding it from the grime. Why do we even come here if no one stops? She asked, folding her legs beneath her on the stool. Because if we don't, no one will ever know we're here, Kai said. That doesn't make sense, Mason muttered. People don't even look. They just zoom past like we're invisible. Kai glanced at him, then at Lana. We're not invisible. We just haven't been seen yet. The words hung heavy in the hot air, both defiant and hollow. Minutes passed. Mason started peeling a banana, one of the old ones. "What would you buy if we sold everything today?" he asked, not expecting a serious answer. Kai answered first. "A sack of rice. Full size, not the small bag Ma usually buys." "Psh," Mason grinned. "I'd get books. Real school books with pages that don't have holes." Lana giggled, then looked thoughtful. "I'd buy a new roof. So when it rains, we don't all move our sleeping mats." Mason tossed the banana peel into the bushes. "Too bad roofs cost more than bananas." Kai cracked a faint smile. "Dream smaller, Lana." She looked at him, chin raised. "I said new roof. Didn't say big house." Kai reached out and tugged at one of her braids. "Okay. Then I'd buy you a bed. One that doesn't creak every time you blink." They all laughed, not loud, but the kind that felt rich because it broke the stillness. "Do you think we'll ever get rich?" Mason asked suddenly. Kai shrugged. "Not the kind of rich that wears shoes in the house. What other kind is there? The kind that doesn't worry every day." Lana leaned forward, whispering Ma said once that when she was young, she dreamed of becoming a teacher. Kai's head turned. "She did." Lana nodded, her voice gentle. "She had a book with a red cover. She used to write pretend lessons in it. I found it under the mat once." Mason looked over. "What happened to it?" "She burned it when the rains came through the roof. Said it was no use keeping paper dreams." They sat in silence after that. A large fly buzzed near the mangoes. Kai swatted it away with a faded plastic fan. The air smelled like hot metal and bruised fruit. And then a sound. Different. Low, steady, polished. Lana turned first. The glint off the front hood hit her eyes. Mason froze. Kai stood. It was a car. A real car. Not the rusted pickups or trotros that coughed smoke. This one was black sleek, the paint so clean it reflected the sky like glass. The windows were tinted, the tires new. It glided along the road like it didn't belong there. Kai stepped forward, instinctive. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He just watched. The car didn't stop, didn't slow, just passed. But in that moment, something shifted. Lana's eyes widened. Her lips parted in the smallest of smiles. Not the playful kind. Not like when Mason did something silly. It was soft, curious. She didn't even realize she was smiling. Kai noticed. He glanced at her, then back at the disappearing vehicle. His face was unreadable. The road went silent again. Dust hung in the air like ghosts. "Who do you think was in there?" Mason asked. "Someone lost," Kai said. "Or someone rich." Kai didn't answer. Lana climbed back onto the stool, still watching the road. Her face had gone still, like she was trying to remember something she hadn't seen. Kai turned his back to the highway, sat down. He picked up the water bottle, took a sip this time. Mason leaned back against the tree trunk, humming that same tune again. The wind picked up briefly, fluttering the cloth that covered the fruit. It lifted like a sail, and then settled. No one said anything else. But something had changed. Not much, not yet. Just a crack, a glimmer, an opening. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself but settles in the bones. And across the field where the sun poured down on the cassava plants like liquid gold. Hannah paused in her hoeing. She stood upright, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Her eyes turned toward the road. She had heard the engine too, and for reasons she couldn't name, her breath caught for just a second. Then she exhaled, bent again, dug deeper. Under the harsh midday sun, the road shimmered like liquid metal, and heat hung thick in the air like the echo of a warning. The children's fruit stand stood quiet, worn but dignified, its wooden legs buried slightly in the red soil to stay firm against the wind that never came. Kai had just picked up the fan again to wave dust off the mangoes when he heard it, a sound. Not the soft drone of motorbikes or the rattling cough of trotros. This was sharp, metal on metal, brakes. The squeal came fast like a scream swallowed mid-sentence, and then a burst of air and dust as a black vehicle, the same one from earlier, came hurtling down the slight bend, its wheels cutting too sharp into the curve of the road. Kai's instincts kicked in. "Move," he barked. Mason leapt away from the cart, just as the vehicle's front bumper clipped the corner of the wooden frame. The entire stand jerked sideways, and in that second time slowed. The crate of papayas tilted and spilled fruit tumbling like dropped lives into the dust. The basket of bananas hit the ground and split open. The pineapples rolled like cannonballs. Lana stumbled backward, falling onto the stool as it collapsed beneath her. Then silence. The car stopped. The engine idled, a deep, steady thrum like an angry breath being held. Kai was already crouched beside Lana. "You okay?" She nodded, eyes wide. Her palms were scraped. Her lip quivered, but she didn't cry. She never cried. Not in front of her brothers. Mason was standing now, hands on his knees, panting. He looked at the crushed fruit like it was a limb that had been severed. Kai rose slowly. His body-tense eyes locked on the car door, and then it opened. The door swung out with the kind of silent authority only money could buy. From behind the tinted window stepped a man in a crisp white shirt. The sleeves rolled neatly above his forearms. His trousers were dark, pressed spotless, until the dust from the road reached them like fingers searching for flaws. He stood straight, controlled, powerful in a way that didn't need to shout. But the second his eyes landed on the girl in the dirt, something shattered. Victor froze. He had seen many faces in his life. Looked at men and women across tables, across contracts, across deals, worth millions. But this face, this child, it wasn't just familiar. It was haunting, a mirror, a memory. A ghost pulled from the flesh of someone he once knew too well. Lana looked up, their eyes locked, her mouth slightly open, his jaw clenched. Time didn't stop. It collapsed. Behind them, the dust began to settle. The mangoes lay bruised. The pineapples were split. Mason muttered something under his breath, but neither of them heard. The world had narrowed to two people, a man with steel in his eyes and a girl who had unknowingly cracked it. Victor took a slow step forward, just one, and then a voice split through the heat like a whip. "Lana." It was sharp, urgent, laced with fear that hadn't yet found its shape. From across the slope, barefoot apron still on, hands streaked with soil, Hannah came running. Her pace wasn't graceful, it was desperate. She didn't care that her scarf was sliding from her hair or that her feet kicked up red dirt. All she saw was the broken stand, her daughter on the ground, and a man stepping closer. Victor heard the voice before he saw her. It hit him in the chest like a blow he didn't expect. His head turned slow, almost reluctant, as though he already knew what he would find. And then he saw her. Hannah, his Hannah, not the girl from years ago who wore blue dresses and read him poems under the trees. This woman was different. Her skin was darker now from the sun, her arms stronger. Her face bore lines that came not from age, but from carrying too much, too many loads, too many secrets, too many nights of silence. But it was her. Victor took another step, his lips parting. His breath hitched, like it had somewhere to run, but no exit. Hannah stopped short, dust swirling around her like a shield. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her eyes scanned the scene, the fruit, the cart, Lana's scraped knees. And then she looked up. She saw him, and everything stopped. The children were silent now, sensing the shift in the air. Kai didn't understand, but he saw his mother's eyes widen. Saw the way her lips pressed tight, like she was holding something back, rage, fear, words. Victor opened his mouth. "Hannah." It was barely a whisper, but it rang. She blinked as if trying to clear the dust or the past from her eyes. Victor stepped forward. Hannah didn't move. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice trembling. It was the most absurd question she had heard in years. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at Lana, helped her to her feet, brushed the dirt from her dress. Her hands were shaking. "You need anything, a doctor?" he asked again, taking another step. "Stay back," Hannah finally said. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was quiet, controlled, but it cut like a blade. Victor stopped. "I didn't see the curve," he said quickly. "The car, it slipped." "I didn't mean. I said stay back." Her eyes had sharpened now, voice steadier, protective, dangerous. Victor raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but in a silent request. For permission, for time, for something he couldn't name. "I was just driving through," he said. "And then I saw her." He looked at Lana again. I didn't know." Didn't know what Hannah's voice cracked. Victor didn't answer. Kai moved to his mother's side, instinctively putting a hand on her arm. He didn't know what was going on, But he knew this. She was scared. And she was never scared. Ma, he whispered. Hannah put a hand on his shoulder. Take your brother and sister. Pack what's left, Mama. Lana said, her voice tiny, her eyes still on Victor. Hannah didn't look at the man again. She picked up the tipped-over crate, her hands shaking. The fruit was ruined. Everything bruised. Another day wasted. Another small defeat. Victor remained still. I didn't expect to see you, he said softly. Hannah didn't respond. I didn't even know you were still alive. Still nothing. I thought you were gone. At that, Hannah did pause. She turned slowly, not with softness, but with something colder. You thought what you were told to think, she said. That's always been your way. Victor swallowed. Hannah, please. No. That single word landed hard. She turned back to the cart. Go, she said. Hannah, go. Back to your world. This one's not yours anymore. Victor stood there a moment longer, but it was over. Whatever he had come to say, whatever had drawn him down that road, had shattered the moment her eyes turned to fire. He turned back toward his car. Dust rose around his shoes as he walked away. The children said nothing as he drove off. They didn't ask who he was, but they would. Soon. Under the orange dusk of Accra 10 years earlier, the air tasted like sea salt and dust. The city never really slept. It buzzed with radios from roadside vendors, with the clink of glasses in chop bars, and the soft chatter of young lovers hiding beneath almond trees along the coast. In those nights, the heat mellowed and the moon cast a kind of forgiving light on everyone, rich or poor, dressed in linen or torn cotton. Victor used to wait for her near the footbridge behind the university, where the concrete met the wild grass and the traffic grew distant. That's where Hannah came every evening, after her work, always around 6:30, always with that same red notebook in her bag, the one she used to sketch dreams in. Dreams she rarely spoke aloud, but ones he could see reflected in her eyes. She wore her hair natural, back then pulled into a soft bun that frizzed by the time she arrived, heat and labor pulling her into the shape of the day. She smelled like detergent and roasted plantains, and the long hours she spent cleaning houses for people who never looked her in the eye. Victor, in his university shirts and pressed khakis, had never met anyone like her. She challenged him. With silence, with simplicity. She made him uncomfortable in ways that felt like growth. When she listened, she made him feel like what he said mattered. When she looked at him, he felt seen, really seen, for the first time in his well-manicured life. They would sit by the trees and talk about things that didn't belong to them. Books, countries. They'd never visit a kind of love that no one ever taught them how to hold. You're too soft for your world, Hannah had told him once, tracing a line in the dirt with her toe. They'll harden you, soften you just enough to shape you, then press you into a mold you'll forget to break out of. He laughed. That's dramatic. You think it's not true. I think I don't want to forget you. She didn't smile. She never smiled at things like that. But she reached for his hand, and that night they kissed for the first time. They were from two different worlds, not just in wealth or family name, but in blood. Hannah was Yue. Her people came from the Volta region. Proud, resilient, often spoken of in hushed tones by older, more conservative Akan families. To Victor's mother, Hannah wasn't just poor. She was unsuitable. A deviation from the lineage she had spent years curating through marriages and business alliances. Victor never told his family about Hannah. Not at first. He wasn't hiding her. He was protecting her. At least that's what he told himself. But secrets grow mold in dark corners. One day, Hannah didn't show up. Victor waited. The second day, he went looking for her. Found the small house she lived in with her aunt tucked behind the fabric market. Knocked. Called. No answer. The third day, he received a call from his mother. You will come home immediately, she said. We need to talk. When he arrived, the air in the house was colder than usual. His mother sat in the parlor, back straight, eyes distant. I heard, she said, without looking at him. Heard what? About the girl? The you girl? Victor didn't flinch. Her name is Hannah. His mother finally turned her gaze on him. Her name doesn't matter. It does to me. She folded her hands in her lap. And what matters to you often becomes a problem for this family. Victor stood firm. I love her. You're young. That will pass. It's not going to pass. Her voice sharpened. You will end this. No. She stared at him. No anger, just pity. And that somehow was worse. She doesn't belong in your world, she said. And you don't belong in hers. Victor's jaw tightened. You don't know her. I don't need to. I know her kind. I know how women like her dream of climbing ladders they didn't build. He turned to walk away. That's when she dropped the real blow. She's already gone. He stopped. What? I made her an offer. Money. Enough to start over somewhere else. Enough to forget you. He spun around. You what? She took it. No, she didn't. You don't believe me. I know her. She would never. His mother rose from the chair, elegant and immovable. That's the problem. You think you know people? But love blinds you, weakens you. Victor stormed out that night. Went back to her house. Knocked again. No answer. A neighbor told him she had packed up and left with her aunt the morning before. No one knew where or why. He waited. Days, weeks. Eventually the ache dulled. The memory became fog. And life moved on, as it always does for people with enough money to cover their wounds. Victor graduated. Took over part of the family business. Dated women who smiled too easily and asked too little. He laughed at the right jokes, attended the right weddings. Eventually, he convinced himself that what happened was youth. That maybe Hannah had taken the money. That maybe she wasn't who he thought she was. Until today, until the girl, until that face. Now in the present, Victor sat behind the wheel of his car again, hands gripping the leather too tightly. His eyes still burned with the dust from the road, or maybe it was something else. He looked at the rearview mirror. Lana, that was her name. She looked just like Hannah. No, that wasn't quite right. She looked like both of them, a fusion, a ripple of the past stitched into flesh and movement. She had Hannah's cheekbones, her jawline. But her eyes, those were his. Victor's throat tightened. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. His body already knew. The car didn't move for a long while. He stared straight ahead, engine humming quietly like a held breath. The weight of realization settled like iron in his chest. He had a daughter, 10 years, no phone call, no letter, nothing, because she never took the money. Because she had been carrying this alone. Victor closed his eyes. Shame is a slow poison. It doesn't burn, it coils. He exhaled, finally started the car, and eased it back onto the road. The wheels turned forward, but something in him was still stuck beneath that neem tree, next to a broken fruit cart, staring into the eyes of a child who unknowingly unburied everything he thought he had lost. As the car picked up speed, he looked into the rear-view mirror one last time. The image of Lana grew smaller, but it didn't fade. Not this time. Not again. The night after the accident, Victor sat alone in his study with the overhead lights turned low. Outside, the rain whispered against the glass windows, soft as breath. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that usually brought peace. But tonight, it only pressed against him, like guilt. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't changed out of his shirt still smudged faintly with dust from the roadside. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the folder on his desk. Inside, nothing more than a name, Hannah, and a town. A place he had once tried to forget. A place that had now pulled him back like a hook in the ribs. He picked up his phone and made a call. I need information, he said when the line connected. Discreet, thorough. The voice on the other end was curt but efficient. Name, Hannah. Last known in Capito Village. Single mother. Used to live in Accra about 10 years ago. Anything else? She might have a daughter named Lana. A pause. I'll get back to you, the voice said, then hung up. Victor leaned back and closed his eyes. The image of Lana wouldn't leave him. It wasn't just her face. It was her gaze. Unafraid, unflinching. Too familiar to be coincidence. 3 days later, the file arrived. It was delivered in a manila envelope, unmarked, slipped under his office door before sunrise. Victor tore it open with trembling fingers. The report was clean, professional. It didn't waste time. Hannah Mensah. Age 33. Gave birth to 3 children approximately 9 years ago, 2 boys and a girl. Names Kai Mason and Lana. No registered father. all born in a clinic on the outskirts of Kumasi. Victor's breath caught as he scanned the next page. Blood type Kai, A Mason, O Lana, B+, his own blood type B+. It was a detail most would overlook. But not him. His family had a rare gene variant that showed up consistently on both sides for generations. There were patterns in the records, and there it was traced again. The girl was his. Victor sat back, his hands limp, the pages sliding from his lap to the floor like feathers. She was his, and Hannah had never told him, but it wasn't anger that bloomed inside him. It was something far more tangled: sorrow, disbelief, and the cold bite of betrayal. Or was it regret? He needed to see her again. Not just to ask why, but to look into her eyes and understand how 10 years could pass in silence. But Victor wasn't the only one paying attention. Kai had seen him return. He was sharp even if he rarely spoke. After the accident, when his mother avoided all questions and his sister grew oddly quiet, Kai knew something was wrong. So when he saw the same black car circle near the roadside stand 2 days later, he followed. He didn't tell Mason or Lana. He just pretended to go gather guavas from a neighbor's tree and slipped down the side path, staying in the trees, barefoot, silent, like he'd been taught by the old herders in the fields. Victor parked just down the slope and walked into the village center. Kai narrowed his eyes. He wasn't there to shop. He wasn't even looking at the stalls. He was looking for her. Kai gripped the bark of a neem tree, watching closely. His mother was there at the back of the small farmer's market. She had brought produce that morning: yams, garden eggs, a few bundles of dried cassava. She was tying them in neat knots when she looked up. She saw him. Victor. Everything around her faded. She wiped her hands on her wrap cloth. Her lips parted slightly, a flicker of hesitation in her movement, then steel set in her jaw. She stood straighter. Victor approached slow and careful, like one wrong step might crack the world beneath him. "Hannah," he said. She didn't answer. "Not yet." He stopped just short of her. "You didn't tell me," he whispered. Still no response. "You had my child? You never told me." She took a breath, deep and quiet. "They weren't just yours," she said. Victor's hands curled at his sides. "Why? You want truth." Her voice cracked slightly. "You can finally stomach it." Victor looked stunned. Hannah continued. "Your mother came to me. Drove to the house I shared with my aunt. She didn't scream, didn't threaten. She offered 10 million cedis in cash." He blinked. "What?" "She said I was a stain. Said I'd ruin your future. That I didn't belong in your bloodline. And she had the money to make sure I disappeared." Victor shook his head. "I didn't know. She never told me." "Of course she didn't. And the money, did you?" "Take it," she laughed. A sound that came out more like a cough. "No." I spat in her face. And the next week, my aunt lost her job. The landlord evicted us. Our names were blacklisted on housing lists. I got death threats from numbers I didn't recognize. You know what that means in Ghana. You disappear or you survive. Victor looked shattered. "Why didn't you come to me?" "I tried," Hannah said, her voice rising. "I went to your office building. They wouldn't let me in. Your guards threw me out. Said you left instructions. No visits from women claiming trouble." That's what they said. Victor's lips parted, but no sound came out. "I was already pregnant," Hannah said softly now. "Didn't even know it yet. But I knew what the world was telling me. Disappear." Victor's eyes glistened. "I never stopped thinking about you," he whispered. "Not really." "I didn't have the luxury," Hannah replied, wiping her hands again. A long pause hung between them. "Lana," he said finally, "she's mine." Hannah nodded once. Victor exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 10 years. "And the boys?" "All 3 are mine," she said. "But only one is yours." He stepped back slightly. "Which one?" Hannah didn't answer. "You can love them all. Or you can love none, but you don't get to cherry pick." Victor felt the weight of that land heavy in his chest. Kai, still watching from the trees, didn't move. He couldn't hear every word, but the way his mother's face moved, the way her fingers trembled, told him everything he needed to know. Victor wasn't just a man with a car. He was history, pain, and maybe family. Back at the market, Victor whispered, "Can I see her? Lana doesn't know." Hannah said, her voice breaking, And I don't want her broken. I won't hurt her. You already did. Victor stepped closer, his voice barely audible. I want to be part of her life. If she'll let me. If you'll let me. Hannah looked up at him, eyes glassy with tears she hadn't allowed in years. This isn't about what you want, Victor. Not anymore. And with that, she turned away. Victor didn't follow. Not yet. But he wasn't leaving either. And Kai still pressed against the tree trunk, finally. Exhaled fists clenched the truth swirling inside him like a storm that hadn't found its thunder yet. Under the marbled floor of a hilltop estate in Accra, the air carried the bite of cold, AC lavender polish and generational pride. The kind that hung framed on the walls, photos of men in suits, women in lace headlines under glass. Rodriguez Group acquires mining contract. Victor Rodriguez joins board of West Gold Consortium. At the center of it all sat Dori Rodriguez, a woman who had built her reputation as immovable. Her voice sharp as glass, her presence colder than the porcelain her house was filled with. She had spent her life grooming Victor to inherit not just the company, but the name, the legacy. Everything was image. Everything was structure. Everything was control. And control she now realized had slipped. The newspaper trembled in her hand, not because of fear, but fury. She slammed the article down on her mahogany desk. How dare he? She hissed through clenched teeth. How dare she? Across the room, her assistant Quabena stood frozen, clutching a tablet loaded with headlines she hadn't even scrolled through yet. He'd been the one to notify her. He was regretting it now. Bring me every file on that woman. Everything. Right now. Yes, madam. And get Ofori from the Daily Chronicle on the phone. But now. The door closed behind him, but her fury stayed vibrating through the air like a coming storm. She stared at the grainy photo printed in the society column of an obscure online blog. Victor beside a roadside fruit stand. Standing next to a woman in a faded wrapper, her arms shielding a small girl from the sun. The caption read, "Could Gay Nana's golden son be hiding a secret past?" It wasn't the headline that enraged her. It was the implication. The dirt. The return of a stain she thought she had erased 10 years ago. That girl. That woman. That mistake. Hannah. She pulled open the drawer of her desk and took out the file she had kept all those years. Faded now, the edges curled but still intact. Photocopies of her offer letter. The money trail. The receipt from the hotel Hannah was meant to check into after she took the bribe and vanished. Except she never did. Dori hadn't forgotten. She just thought it was handled. But now, Hannah was back, not just alive, but with a child. A child that could be her granddaughter. No. She would not let this woman ruin everything she had built. By week's end, whispers swept through the village like wind through dry cassava leaves. It began with an article in a Sunday tabloid. Then another on a political gossip blog. Headline, Uwe housemaid. Turned street vendor, Victor Rodriguez's hidden scandal. The articles used photos from 10 years ago. Accusations, rumors, carefully selected quotes pulled out of nowhere. She used to steal from the houses she cleaned. Got pregnant and blamed the boss's son. Hannah's name wasn't printed, but the details were clear. Too clear. Those who had heard of her story in whispers now read it in bold-faced lies. It didn't take long for the murmurs to begin. In the market, women stopped greeting her. At church, people glanced, then looked away. At the well, two mothers pulled their children aside when Lana approached. The first real blow came when Kai returned home with a bloodied lip. Hannah had been washing cassava outside when she saw him. His eye was swollen, shirt torn. What happened? They said we're bastards, Kai said quietly. Said you're a whore who chased money in Accra. Hannah dropped the knife she'd been peeling with. Lana nearby overheard. She didn't speak, just turned and walked back into the house. Mason said nothing, just sat beside his brother and stared at the red clay wall of their home. Later that night, Hannah lit a candle and sat alone. She held the newspaper in her hands. Her fingers were blackened from flipping through it so many times. She stared at her own picture, a blurry shot of her from the market. The caption called her the vendor with a past. She hadn't cried in years, but that night she did. Not loud, Not long, but real tears. Heavy ones. That left her cheeks damp and her throat sore. 2 days later, she packed their things. She didn't say why. She just folded the clothes, gathered the food, told Kai to check the cart's wheels and Mason to cover the crates. "Where are we going?" Lana asked. "Somewhere new," Hannah said. "No!" Mason shouted, slamming a mango into the ground. "We didn't do anything wrong. Why do we have to run again?" Kai placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "We're not running," Hannah said softly. "We're surviving." But even she didn't believe it. She hated this, the return to fear, to shadows, to exile. She thought she had buried all that with the last name she shed. But Dory hadn't just dragged her out of hiding. She'd dragged the children too, into ridicule, into shame. And Hannah had no fight left, not this time. She sat down in the middle of the room on the dirt floor and buried her face in her hands. The children watched in silence. They had never seen her like this, never broken. Back in Accra, Victor confronted his mother. The argument began calmly, but minutes in the gloves came off. "You had no right," Victor yelled. "I had every right," Dory snapped. "I built this family. I protected your name. You dragged her through the dirt." "She is dirt." Victor's fist hit the table. "She's the mother of my child." Dory rose to her full height, her voice trembling not with fear, but fury. "She is a mistake, one I tried to pay off. If you had listened, we wouldn't be here. I didn't know. That's because you chose not to." Victor pointed at her. "You humiliated her. You humiliated my daughter. You think this is about a child?" Dory scoffed. "This is about bloodlines, about legacy. You marry her, and our name turns to ash. I'm not asking your permission, no. But you're begging for ruin." Victor turned to leave. Dory called after him. "She'll ruin you." He didn't respond. But back in the village, the damage had already been done. Hannah sat by the road, with the cart packed but unmoving. Lana came and sat beside her. "Are we leaving tomorrow?" "I think so." Lana was quiet for a long time. "Will Victor come again?" Hannah looked down at her daughter, her soft cheeks, her braid undone. "I don't know," she whispered. "Will we ever be happy again?" Hannah's breath caught. She had no answer, only hope. And tonight even that felt thin. The rain had stopped, but the mud still clung to the soles of every step Hannah took. She moved like a ghost in her own village, now present, but seen only through layers of judgment and whispers. Kai had watched it for days. The way she no longer held her head up. The way her hands moved slower, less certain. The way Lana had stopped humming when she helped peel cassava. Their mother had changed. The world had wounded her. And Kai, barely 13, decided the world would not get the final word. That Sunday morning, long before the sun shook off the clouds, he slipped out of the house, with Mason trailing him sleepily. Together they rolled the wooden cart out from its resting place behind the hut, its wheels creaking like tired bones. Instead of heading for the main road, Kai pushed it toward the center of the village into the open square where elders usually played ower and women bartered gossip more than vegetables. He set up everything with care. A cloth spread neatly, mangoes arranged in rows like soldiers, squash at the corners, pineapples in the center. But this time it wasn't just for selling. This was for something else. He had drawn a sign the night before hiding in the corner of their hut with a charcoal stub and a scrap of cardboard. It read, "From our soil, for our people. Truth grows here too." Mason stared at it, unsure what it meant, but felt the weight of it anyway. By noon, a few neighbors gathered, not to buy, just to see. Curious, the Rodriguez child people whispered now. The love child of scandal. They pointed at Kai. He didn't blink. He greeted each one. "Good afternoon, ma'am." "Yes, they're ripe. No chemicals. Mama says we don't sell what we won't eat." Then something shifted. An elder stepped forward, Uncle Kojo, bent-backed but sharp-eyed. He bought a squash. Didn't haggle. Just paid. Then someone else bought okra. Then bananas. Then slowly the square filled. By the time Hannah stepped out of the house, pulled by the noise, the village center was bustling. For a second she thought she was dreaming. Then she saw Kai standing behind the cart, like a man twice his age, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He looked up, saw her, and smiled. Hannah pressed a hand to her mouth, the world tilting. She hadn't known. He hadn't asked. He had just done it. For her. And that's when Victor came. He didn't arrive in silence this time. He came in daylight, in the open. His black car pulled into the edge of the square and idled. The crowd noticed immediately. Conversation stopped. Children clutched their mothers. Eyes turned. Victor stepped out. In his hand was a brown envelope. In his eyes was resolve. He walked through this crowd like a man with nothing to hide. When he reached the cart, he didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke to Hannah. "I had the land papers certified," he said gently, handing her the envelope. "The farm plot your father left. It's now in your name, properly, no risk of dispute." Hannah stared at the envelope, but didn't take it. Victor continued louder now so others could hear. "I've also paid the overdue tax notices. You didn't know there were 3, but there were. They've been cleared." More eyes turned. The murmurs began again. Hannah stepped back. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's yours. Because I owe you more than I can say." She looked around. Faces watching, judging. She stepped forward until they stood nearly toe to toe. "I don't need your guilt," she said, her voice like gravel. "I don't need your redemption story. I'm not a chapter in your healing arc." Victor's lips parted, stung. "I'm not trying to—" She raised a hand. "What I need is truth. Not papers, not land, not money." The crowd leaned in. "I need you to look them in the eye," she said, sweeping her arm across the gathering, "and tell them the story they've only heard in pieces. The real one. Not the one your mother printed in her lies." Victor swallowed. Hannah's eyes burned. "I don't want to be rescued, Victor. I want to be believed." He turned to the people. They were silent now. Old women, young boys. His daughter standing in the back watching him like a stranger. He took a breath and spoke. "My name is Victor Rodriguez," he began. "Many of you know the name, not the man. And 10 years ago I made a mistake that cost me everything. No one moved. I fell in love with a woman who taught me what it meant to see. Hannah Mensah. She didn't ask for anything. I never gave her enough. And when she disappeared, I believed a lie, that someone close to me told that she left me for money." He paused. "Let it sink. She didn't. The wind shifted. I found out too late. Found out she was threatened, her family sabotaged, pushed into exile while I lived in comfort. And when I met my daughter a few days ago, I realized something. I can't undo what was done. But I can tell the truth." A murmur of surprise passed through the crowd. "She didn't chase me. She didn't steal. She didn't lie. Everything my family printed about her was false." He turned back to Hannah. "I'm sorry." Silence. Then from the back a voice spoke. "People change when it's convenient," someone muttered. But another voice rose. "Maybe. But at least he's saying it out loud, in front of us." Another voice. "And the paper? That was a lie." Victor nodded. "Then your mother is the one who should be ashamed." Laughter, bitter and sharp, rippled. Hannah's knees felt weak. Kai stepped beside her, held her hand. Victor looked at Lana, then at Kai and Mason. "I want to know all of them, not just Lana. You may want." Hannah said, her voice suddenly softer, "But you'll have to earn it." Victor nodded. "I intend to." The crowd began to shift. Some walked away skeptical. Others lingered. A few even nodded at Hannah. Something had broken. Not completely, but enough to let light in. That evening, back at their house, Hannah sat outside with the envelope unopened beside her. Lana curled in her lap. Mason played with a broken toy. Kai sat sharpening a stick into a spear. "Did we win?" Mama Mason asked. Hannah didn't answer immediately. She looked at the cart, empty now, but for the cloth folded neatly. "We didn't win," she said quietly. "But we didn't lose either." "And him?" Kai asked. She glanced toward the road where Victor's car had disappeared. "That's not the end of him," she said. "Good or bad? We'll find out." She looked at the 3 of them. Her heart will stand, she said mostly to herself, no matter what storm comes next. And in the fading light, for the first time in days, she smiled. The morning mist still clung to the cassava leaves as Hannah stood by the fire, her hands working instinctively over a steaming pot of cornmeal porridge. The rhythmic swirl of her wooden spoon matched the quiet thud of Kai splitting firewood a few yards away. Mason chased a chicken lazily across the yard. Lana, as usual, was curled beneath the neem tree with her mother's red notebook worn at the edges, its pages soft and almost translucent with age. Victor had come again the day before. But this time he hadn't come bearing apologies or legal forms. He came with an offer. A stall, he had said. In the Central Market, a proper one. Roof, signage, refrigeration, even a logo if you want. I'll cover the first year. After that, it's yours. She had stared at him, unmoving. A chance to rebuild, he added. The city's different now, and you deserve more than this sun and soil. It wasn't said with cruelty. It was said with concern, with softness. But even in softness, Hannah heard threat. She hadn't answered right away, only nodded and said, I'll think about it. Now stirring porridge with the edge of the morning sun in her eyes, she knew her answer. She wouldn't go, because leaving wouldn't be healing. It would be erasure. She'd spent 10 years putting roots into this ground, roots made of struggle and breath and early morning sweat. She would not abandon it now just because the world finally decided to see her. She would stay, but she would not stay small. Later that afternoon, Hannah walked across the village to speak with Madame Essie, the oldest woman in their farming cooperative. Her fingers were twisted with age, but her voice still cracked through silence like a bell. You want to start, what Essie asked, leaning on her cane. A cooperative, Hannah said. Properly, with training, distribution, shared profit. Essie raised one eyebrow. You plan to teach old women to farm better than their grandmothers? I plan to show them the world doesn't have to stay the way it's always been, Hannah replied. We grow what we can, sell what we can, but we've never had leverage. Victor offered me a lifeline, but I'm not the only one drowning. Essie looked her over, then gave a slow nod. You're your father's daughter. That night they drew up names on paper. Hannah would not go back to Accra. She would build something here, something rooted, something that couldn't be stolen. Inside the house, under the faint light of an oil lamp, Lana flipped through the last pages of her mother's notebook. She'd always loved the smell of it. The ink faded but warm, like old memories trapped between dry skin. She'd read most of it before. Shopping lists, planting cycles, recipes for soap and balm. But tonight, something new caught her eye. Tucked into the back cover, a folded page. More delicate than the rest. She opened it slowly. It wasn't a list. It was a letter, written but never sent. Lana recognized her name immediately, her own name written in sweeping script. Below it, words that felt too careful to be random. To my daughter, if you ever find this. Her heart raced. She read on. It was dated nearly 8 years ago. The letter told of a time before the village, before the fruit stand, before the stormy nights, huddled under leaking zinc roofs. It told of Accra, of love, of loss, of a man named Victor, a man with eyes like hers. Lana's hands began to shake. She read the words 3 times over. But each time her world grew quieter. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was disoriented, like standing in a room where everything looked the same, but smelled different. She set the letter down and stared at the wall. Her heart beat so loudly she didn't hear her mother return. Hannah stood in the doorway, arms filled with dried maize husks. Her eyes immediately found her daughter's face, pale frozen. Then she saw the notebook. Open. The letter. Exposed. For one eternal second, neither of them moved. Then Lana stood. Is it true? She asked. Hannah's lips parted, but no words came. Victor, is he? Hannah nodded. Lana blinked fast, her throat tightening. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to, Hannah said, voice breaking. So many times. Then why didn't you? Because I didn't want you to grow up waiting for someone who might never come. Lana looked down at the paper. You wrote this, she said. But you didn't send it. I was afraid. Silence. Lana's breath came uneven now. Her voice barely above a whisper. So every time I asked where I got my nose from, every time I asked why my skin was lighter, I told you stories, Hannah said, her tears falling now. Of rivers and sun and wind. I told you stories because the truth was too sharp. Lana didn't speak again. She walked to the corner of the room, picked up the small wooden comb she always used, and began dragging it through her hair in short, angry strokes. Hannah watched and waited. After a while, Lana spoke. He was here, wasn't he? Hannah nodded. Did he ask for me? He did. What did you say? I said, he had to earn you. Lana's eyes finally met hers. And if I want to know him? Hannah didn't look away. Then you'll know him. I won't stand in your way. And then finally she stepped forward, took her daughter's hand, and wept, not because she had been caught, but because the truth had finally come home, because the child she had raised with stories now stood before her as a girl who could finally carry truth, even if it hurt, especially because it hurt. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the yard. Inside, a mother and daughter sat in silence. The truth didn't break them. It bound them, different now, but still whole. The sky above the village had turned the color of bruised mango skin somewhere between gold and purple, like dusk was undecided. Inside the small clay house, a silence heavier than any storm settled in the air. The children sat cross-legged on the woven mat. Kai, Mason, Lana. No one was smiling. Hannah stood in front of them, palms damp, heart pounding, as if trying to break free from her chest. She had spoken to the earth, the market, the elders, but never like this. Never to her own blood. Never with a truth she had once promised herself she'd carry to the grave. She cleared her throat. Kai watched her with quiet intensity. Mason tapped his knee, restless. Lana clutched a corner of the red notebook in her lap. Hannah took a breath, and another, and then she began. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice low but steady. "About your father." 3 pairs of eyes locked onto her. "For a long time I told you he was gone. That he wasn't around. That he left before you were born." A pause. That wasn't the full truth. Lana's lip quivered. She already knew. She had read the letter. But hearing the words spoken into the open air was something else entirely. Mason frowned. "What do you mean?" Kai didn't say a word. His arms were folded across his chest, but his jaw had gone tight. "I met your father when I lived in the city," Hannah said. "We were young. I worked as a cleaner. He was a student from a wealthy family. We loved each other." Mason scoffed. "So where was this love when we were starving?" Mason, Lana whispered, but he didn't look at her. Hannah nodded slowly. "You have every right to be angry." "I'm not angry," Mason said. "I'm disgusted," Mason, Kai said quietly. But the boy was already on his feet. All these years. All those nights when we shared one bowl of food, one school uniform, and you knew. You knew someone out there could have helped us, and you said nothing. Tears welled in Hannah's eyes. "I didn't want to put your lives in danger. His family, they were powerful. They tried to erase me. I didn't think they'd ever accept you. But you never gave us the chance to decide." Mason snapped. "You decided for us." Lana couldn't hold back anymore. She began to cry, soft at first, then stronger. Hannah reached toward her, but Lana pulled back. Kai still hadn't spoken. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands clenched into tight, quiet fists. "I'm sorry," Hannah said. "I did what I thought was best. I chose to protect you." "You chose silence," Mason muttered. Kai finally looked up. His voice was calm, but heavy. "Is he here?" Hannah blinked. "What?" "You told us this now. So is he here?" A knock at the door answered for her. They all turned. She hadn't told them Victor would come. She hadn't planned to. But after Lana found the letter, and after she saw the weight it brought her daughter, Hannah knew the truth could no longer exist in fragments. The truth had to be faced fully. She stepped to the door and opened it. Victor stood in the fading light, not in a suit, not in polished shoes, just a plain shirt, dust on his trousers, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the last 10 years searching for something he hadn't known he'd lost. When he saw the children, his child, his breath caught. Kai stood protectively. Mason narrowed his eyes. Lana looked away. Victor took a step inside. He didn't speak right away. He just dropped to one knee. Not out of drama, but humility. A father stripped of title, of history, of excuses. "I didn't know," he said finally. "But that's not your fault. It's mine. And I won't pretend I can undo anything. I'm not here to ask for love. I'm here to offer truth." He turned to Hannah. "If they'll have me, I want to be here. Not just for Lana. For all of them." Mason barked a bitter laugh. "And then what? You throw some money at us and disappear again?" Victor shook his head. "No. I've made a lot of mistakes. I believed lies. I let silence replace love. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." Lana finally looked at him. "Why now?" "Because now I know the truth. Because now I see you." She looked away again. Victor's voice softened. "You don't have to believe me yet. But I'll wait until you do." Hannah stepped forward, then her shoulders straight, her eyes blazing with something stronger than fire. "If you want to be a father," she said, "you have to do it right. No halfway. No appearances, no swooping in when it's convenient. I understand, Victor said. No, she snapped. You need to hear this. He nodded. You don't just get the title. You carry the weight. You wake up early. You wait in the rain for school buses. You hold their fears when they don't have words for them. You show up. You listen. You stay. I will, he said, voice cracking. And you do it, Hannah continued. Not because they owe you, but because you owe them. I know, he whispered. She looked him in the eye. Then we start from zero. Not as savior, not as stranger, as man, as father. From the dirt up, Victor bowed his head. Yes? A long silence followed. Then softly Kai spoke. We'll watch, that's all. Mason didn't speak, but he didn't leave. Lana stepped forward. You don't have to prove anything to me, she said. Just don't lie, ever again. Victor nodded, his throat too full to answer. The lamp flickered, and in that room of broken truths and trembling hearts, something unspoken began to mend. Not fully, not instantly, but enough for a new beginning. The old cottage on the eastern ridge of the village had been empty for years. Its roof patched with rusted tin. Its door leaning crooked on one hinge. No one had lived there since the fisherman who built it passed away during a storm 5 harvests ago. But that morning it came alive again with the sound of hammering, the scrape of a hoe, clearing weeds and laughter. Victor Rodriguez had moved in. Not with fanfare, not with assistants or trucks full of furniture. Just a small bag, a mattress strapped to a borrowed pickup, and a promise to do this right. He cut ties with his estate in Accra. He turned down 3 board meetings. He sold his second car, and he came back not just to see his daughter, but to build a life that could hold her. That first week, he walked behind Kai along the narrow dirt path to the waterhole. The boy didn't speak much, but he handed Victor the smaller jerry can without being asked. They took turns drawing from the well, their hands slick with effort. On the way back, Victor tripped over a root, fell hard, and burst into laughter as red clay covered his trousers. Kai chuckled too quietly, then offered a hand without a word. With Mason, it was different, more guarded, more barbed. But one day the boy dragged a sack of dried beans to the garden behind the house and tossed a second hoe to Victor's feet. You know how to plant or just sign checks? Mason asked. Victor smiled, wiped his hands, and started digging. By the end of the day, they'd carved 10 rows, and Mason had stopped calling him sir. Lana was slower to trust, but on a humid afternoon, she brought her favorite calabash bowl and sat beside Victor under the neem tree. She hummed at first a melody he didn't recognize, soft and slow like breath. Then she began to sing. The lyrics were in Yue. Victor didn't understand a word, but he didn't need to. The way her voice caught on the wind, the way she leaned into each line, like it held pieces of her soul, he knew it was sacred. When she finished, she looked at him with careful eyes. Do you want to learn it? She asked. He nodded. Teach me. She sang again, slower this time. He fumbled, mispronounced half the words, but he tried. And she laughed. And somewhere between syllables, between generations of wounds, and time and distance, a bridge formed. From afar, someone was watching. Dory Rodriguez sat stiffly in the back of a hired car parked beneath a mango tree at the edge of the village. She hadn't told Victor she was coming. She hadn't stepped out. She merely observed. Her son in the dirt, bent over a hoe, sharing fruit with children who bore pieces of her face, pieces of her shame. She'd always imagined power as something clean, elevated, distant. But here, under a cracked tin roof, Victor was smiling, real smiles, the kind that wrinkled his eyes and made his posture softer. He laughed with the children. He burned his fingers on hot porridge. He chased chickens out of the garden with a stick and shouted in Twi so broken it made them all double over in laughter. This wasn't weakness. It was joy. Dory didn't know how to name the ache in her chest. She'd buried so many things beneath wealth, beneath control. Now watching Victor carry water with Kai on one shoulder and a sack of cassava on the other, something inside her began to loosen. She folded the edge of her silk scarf and dabbed at the corner of her eye, blaming the heat. The driver didn't ask questions. That night, Victor sat beneath the stars with Hannah. A fire crackled between them, soft embers floating upward like silent prayers. You're really doing this, she said. I'm already doing it. They'll still talk. They'll still judge you. Victor poked at the fire. Let them. For the first time in years, I feel honest. Hannah looked at him, long and hard. You were raised in marble halls, she said. Now you sleep on mud floors. I sleep deeper. She almost smiled. He turned to her serious now. I'm not asking for anything from you. Not love, not redemption. Just space. To be present. She stared into the fire. They'll want answers, eventually, she said. About us. I'll wait, he said, however long it takes. They sat in silence. Not the tense kind. The healing kind. The fire cracked louder. From inside the house, Lana's voice drifted out, humming again, that lullaby of hers now, faintly echoed by Mason, who had started to learn the words. Kai had fallen asleep with a book across his chest, a flashlight dimming at his side. And in that moment, beneath a sky vast and endless, a broken family sat in quiet pieces, not fixed, not perfect, but beginning. And beginning sometimes is more powerful than anything else. From the top of the ridge behind the tall shrubs where the wind swept strong, Dory sat again the next morning. Alone. No car this time, no assistant, just a walking stick and a flask of tea. She watched them laugh. Watched Victor push Lana on a swing made from rope and a tire. Watched Mason teach him how to gut a fish. Watched Kai fall asleep with his head on his father's shoulder. She wiped her eyes again. But this time, she didn't pretend it was the sun. The morning sun filtered gently through the new window panes of Hannah's modest concrete house, their first with a real foundation, not clay. The roof no longer leaked when it rained. There was space now for a dining table, even if it was second-hand. On the walls, hand-drawn pictures from Lana and Mason hung beside dried herbs Hannah strung across the ceiling for luck. The house didn't gleam, but it breathed. It had been paid for in full with vegetables, fruit, and sweat. And today it was full of laughter. Kai had strung banana leaves from one beam to another. Mason balanced a pot of jollof rice between two bricks outside. Lana was in the center of it all, placing carved wooden cups along the table, humming softly. No one mentioned it was their shared birthday. No one needed to. They were triplets. But somehow this one felt different. Okay, Mason announced, wiping his hands on his shorts. No one touches the cake until I light the candles. We don't even have candles, Kai teased. It's a metaphor, Mason shouted, and laughter erupted across the yard. Victor arrived around noon, dressed simply but clean, his arms cradling something wrapped in a jute sack. A present, Lana asked, running to meet him. Victor nodded. It's a little unusual. He knelt, opened the sack, and slowly revealed the base of a young coconut tree, its roots damp wrapped gently in burlap. A tree. Mason blinked. What are we supposed to do with a tree? Victor smiled. Plant it. Lana tilted her head. Where? In your front yard, he said. So you'll always know where home is. Kai crouched beside it, examining the roots. Victor looked at them all. This tree, it grows slow. Really slow. But it lasts. Long after storms, long after those who planted it are gone. He looked at Hannah then. And if you take care of it, it will feed you. Give you shade. Water. Shelter. Hannah said nothing. But her arms crossed across her chest, relaxed ever so slightly. Victor continued. It's like us. We started broken. But we're growing. Slowly. Deeply. The children clapped, even Mason. Can I name it? Lana asked. Victor laughed. Of course. I'll call it Promise. Everyone nodded in approval. And then Kai stood brushing dirt from his palms. Let's plant it now. They dug a shallow hole beneath the neem tree, Lana, holding the base, Victor packing soil around the roots. When they were finished, Mason poured a bowl of water at its base, with more ceremony than skill. As they stood in silence, admiring the small tree, a figure appeared at the far edge of the yard. No one noticed her at first. She was dressed in neutral colors. No chauffeur, no pearls. Just a walking stick and silence. Dory. She had come alone. Victor saw her first. He straightened, unsure whether to move toward her. But he didn't have to. She walked forward slowly, her steps careful, her expression unreadable. The children turned next, Lana clinging unconsciously to Victor's arm. Hannah stood still. When Dory reached them, she looked not at her son, but at the tree. You planted a coconut, she said, voice dry. Victor nodded. It felt right. Dory looked at Hannah. "I didn't think I'd be welcome." "You're not," Mason muttered under his breath. Dory heard it. She turned to him, her lips trembling, then back to Hannah. "I've made mistakes," she said. "I've tried to justify them, with status, with control, with fear." She looked at Lana, then at Kai, then Mason. "But these children, they are not mistakes." Her gaze landed on Hannah again. Her voice cracked. "And neither were you." For a long time no one spoke. Then slowly Dory opened her arms. She didn't ask for permission, just stood there, vulnerable for the first time. Lana was the first to move. She walked toward her grandmother and wrapped her arms around her. Dory choked on a breath. Then Kai followed. Mason hesitated, arms folded. Then he sighed, loud and dramatic, and joined them. Hannah watched, arms still crossed, but her eyes were wet. Dory looked at her over the heads of the children. "Please," she whispered, "let me be part of them." Hannah nodded, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in something gentler, a beginning. And above them, the new coconut tree fluttered in the wind, still small, but rooted. The sun had begun its descent, casting long golden fingers across the red clay paths and over the tops of the maize fields. A chorus of insects buzzed low and steady, the kind of song that only belonged to late afternoons in the dry season. A breeze moved gently through the banana trees, swaying hammocks and skirts alike. At the edge of the village, where a wooden sign now read, "Green Roots Cooperative, Training Tomorrow's Soil," a group of women sat in a semicircle under a makeshift canopy of stitched tarps and palm leaves. Their hands were calloused, their clothes faded, but their eyes burned bright with curiosity. Hannah stood before them holding up a bundle of compost-rich soil. "This," she said, smiling, "is where it begins." She spoke of rotation, of rainfall memory, of organic feeding. Not just planting seeds, but restoring tired land, rebuilding trust in the ground beneath their feet. She gestured to small wooden beds filled with okra pepper and cassava. Behind her, Lana helped two younger girls water seedlings with calabashes. The girls giggled as they splashed each other, and Hannah smiled, her voice rising above the breeze. It wasn't just a lesson, it was reclamation. It was everything no one had ever given her now, given freely. And in the distance, a bus honked twice before coming to a dusty stop beside the co-op. Painted in uneven letters on its rear window, Faith Express, Safe Roads, Honest Fare. Victor stepped off, dusting his sleeves. He wore a faded blue driver's shirt and black trousers. No one would mistake him for a businessman now. But in his hand was a plastic container filled with leftover plantain chips he'd brought from a roadside stop. He waved at Hannah, who raised her brow but didn't stop the lesson. He winked at Lana, who rolled her eyes and waved back. Victor had taken the long road to stay close, driving passengers across towns, earning humble money, but ending each route within reach of this place, of this family. He no longer craved legacy. He chased connection. And every evening, when the last ride ended, he returned not to a mansion, but to the porch of the small house where the coconut tree now stood tall enough to cast shade. That night, under its growing canopy, the family gathered. A woven mat spread out beneath the tree. A pot of jollof rice sat at the center, one bowl passed around. Hannah sat cross-legged, rice balanced on her lap, laughing as Mason argued with Kai over who had eaten more. Lana sang softly again, that lullaby, now joined by Victor, who was still getting the words wrong. They didn't mind. No silverware, no ceremony. Just the sacred rhythm of shared hands, shared stories, shared silence. Then, in the dimming light, Kai looked around and whispered, "This is the richest I've ever felt." Hannah reached over and rested her hand on his. Victor nodded, eyes wet, voice low. "Me too." As the camera panned slowly back, revealing the tree, the meal, the laughter, a voice cut gently through the dusk, calm and sure like the wind brushing the earth. "It's never about what waits on the other side of the hill." The screen faded slowly to the soft rustling of leaves and children's giggles. "But who is waiting for you when you get there?"